Chair now recognizes Mr. Cloud from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for sticking with us through the day. I appreciate you being here. Your agency, of course, is responsible for evaluating the safety and effectiveness of medications that millions of Americans rely on. And I'm sure that your scientists and those working there view themselves as committed public servants. I wanted to talk to you, though, about something that is concerning, I think, to a lot of Americans, and that is potential conflicts of interest. In 2018, the Journal of Science found that 11 out of 16 medical examiners who left the FDA ended up working for companies they previously were responsible for regulating. That's roughly 2/3 or more than 2/3. These wealthy and powerful pharmaceutical companies recruit former FDA employees with lucrative job offers in order to leverage their connections. Existing law imposes only a very limited restrictions on this revolving door. Former employees are only prohibited from lobbying the FDA for very few specific matters, and they're only subject to a 2-year cooling off period. Meanwhile, former FDA employees can go and collect, pretty substantial paychecks from companies once regulated. Just 2 months after leaving the government service, the lead medical officer for the FDA's Office of Vaccine Research and Review took a high-level job at Moderna. There was another one recently, the medical officer who decided on behalf of the FDA whether the clinical data for Moderna's vaccine medicine met approval standards, also took a job shortly after that with the company, just months after the vaccine received license. And so I think you can see why many Americans can look at a history of this and be very, very concerned about what's going on, especially, coming out of COVID, FDA, along with a number of agencies. I think we can all look back and say there were a lot of lessons learned. It wasn't handled really in the best. And so right now we're trying to restore the American populace's faith in a lot of these institutions that you're now leading and have just taken up the mantle recently with again. Can you speak to that issue, with regard to these two FDA officials specifically? Did either of these recuse themselves from any matter at the FDA while seeking these jobs that you're aware of?
Well, that is, this last point you made is a very important part of the system, regardless of how you feel about the other parts of people moving from FDA to industry or industry into FDA. You're prohibited from seeking a job in the area that you're regulating unless you recuse yourself. So that is something that...
the FDA has refused to acknowledge on these two individuals, Dr. Dorian Fink and Dr. Jaya Goswami, I believe is the pronunciation, whether or not these two recuse themselves of their involvement in these areas that they were leading before going to Moderna. So why has the FDA refused to provide the information?
I'm unaware of what you're describing. We'll certainly go back and look into that. Again, if they were not seeking employment while they were regulating, then they didn't violate anything.
Do we know that they sought guidance on approval of the FDA? I'm sorry, the FDA's ethics office before taking those jobs?
I would expect that they would have, but I don't know that. We'll have to go back.
Can you understand the concern, and what recommendations would you provide? From I think it was 1981 to 2019, 9 of the 10 commissioners went into work for pharmaceutical companies from leaving their office. You were one of those as well. I'm not suggesting any impropriety at this point, but you can certainly see, I think, how this would create a huge concern, a conflict of interest when the American people are looking at this. What recommendations would you suggest that we bring up to make sure that the American people can know that the decisions being made? Because here's the thing, you're supposed to give oversight to these companies, whether you're in food and drug industry, and you know that you're not going to get a job, not you specifically, I'm speaking, someone who wants one of these high-paying jobs after leaving the department knows that, they're not going to be hired by someone who was very strict on them. And so there's a built-in incentive, of course, to be lax in these things. And so what can we do in Congress to provide a level playing field that will help restore the public's trust in this area.
Glad to engage in a discussion with you on that, but I do want to point out something about this. We're dealing with inside the FDA, we're dealing with highly technical issues that require a lot of expertise. There are many people who work in industry and then volunteer to come to FDA for a much lower salary because they're attracted to the issue of understanding the science and making good decisions based on it. By the same token, there are people who work within the FDA for a period of time. They have skills and knowledge about an area. And, you know, it's an issue to say, well, they could never work in an industry where they might develop a cure for cancer or whatever the thing may be. So this is a delicate area. It needs to be looked at. You're perfectly right to raise the issue.
I'm not saying that there's no legitimate reason. This is why I'm asking for your recommendations as someone who's actually running, you know, the agency right now. What protections could we put? What recommendations would you provide that would not be onerous, but, you know, 9 out of 10 going straight to the pharmaceutical company, straight out of office is, you know, pretty circumspect when the American people are looking at that. So what would you recommend for us as Congress that would be reasonable provisions that would allow us to bring the full faith of these agencies back to the United States?
His time's expired, but please answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated area. I would say number one is just making sure we adhere to what we already said. You've raised some questions about this. There are
exceptions are given all the time to these, is my understanding. You know, so there's rules, but we waive them all the time because it's a self-check kind of.
I don't think that's true at all. I would speak very highly of our ethics office. I was 2016 the first time around. I spent a lot of time bringing in new people, and I don't think exceptions are given all the time to these. But we can always do better, and I'm happy to engage on it.
So no recommendations so far?
Well, it's a very broad area, so I'm reluctant to just off the cuff make a specific recommendation.
Well, look forward to working with you.
All right,